Hello and welcome to The Music of Chia, channeling the soul of New Caledonia. I'm John Robert Matz, and this is GDC 2024's audio track. Before we get started, they asked me to remind you to silence your cell phones, your pagers, your cool watches, any other cool noisemakers, that analog pocket you've left in suspend mode for too long. Turn those off for now. Thank you. Let's dive in. So, who am I? Like I said, I'm John Robert Matz, and I'm the composer on Chia. I've also worked on games like Ambition, A Minuet in Power, a late Baroque slant classical period score for a game set on the eve of the French Revolution. Mythgard, a cyberpunk meets mythology fusion of electronics, orchestra, and weird hybrid sounds. For the King and For the King 2, a fantasy score with a soul made of early music, Renaissance, medieval music, instrumentation and harmony, and Fossil Echo, the first game from Chia developers Awaseb, a fantastical spiritual journey with a lot of interesting, vaguely world music-inspired sounds, but relatively unfettered from any real-world equivalent cultures. Now, as you can kind of see from this, I'm no stranger to different sounds and styles, but Chia required a different approach. The core development team at Awaseb hailed from this little island country between Australia and New Zealand, New Caledonia. They wanted to make something that really spoke to their culture, that highlighted their mythology, their geography, their natural world, their customs and traditions, and this is where I come in, their music. Now, you may have noticed something. I'm not from there. I'm quite possibly the whitest kid you could ask to do this. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. I've barely even seen the sea, never mind swimming in it or sailing on it. The phrase that came to mind as I was writing this was that I was probably the most uniquely unqualified person to write this score. I think I asked them a couple times, like, are you sure you want me to do this? But they did want me. They loved what I did on Fossil Echo so much that they had to have me back for their second outing, leaping from this linear, relatively simple 2D hand-drawn platformer to a sprawling open-world adventure loaded with activities, cinematic sequences, and tons of nooks and crannies to explore, scattered across this huge archipelago, a fictionalized version of real-life New Caledonia. I had to do this right. Thankfully, I had friends and artistic collaborators to draw upon. The first step was research. It was time for a deep dive. I spent months researching, like probably 6-9 months, just watching documentaries, reading musicological journals, digital museum exhibits, all manner of things, almost all of them in French, a language I do not speak. I must have asked a million questions of Phil Crefo, our lead developer, and traded dozens and dozens of musical examples, references, etc., all working towards getting a grasp on what made New Caledonian music distinctly New Caledonian. There was a real fear, and to be fair, a real danger that Chia would be perceived as indie game Moana. And we really didn't want that, nor did we want the score to lean into anything that felt particularly Moana-ish. As such, I tried to consciously steer away from anything that felt particularly like a big Hollywood sound and do my best to integrate as many uniquely New Caledonian timbres and musical elements as I could. Now, New Caledonia is home to a host of interesting types of music, but a distinct genre that we'll focus on here, one that began to form in the 1970s and really flourished into the 80s and persists to today. Keka music is a homegrown genre that blends a lot of elements from other genres with traditional New Caledonian sounds and rhythms. Elements of reggae, rock, soul music, even rap and funk kind of infuse it, and lyrics can touch on anything from the challenges of everyday life to politically charged speech pushing for social change. From the outset, one of the things that Phil wanted to feature in our musical landscape were several licensed tracks from notable New Caledonian artists, Guru Jele and Paul Wamo. So everything that I wrote had to complement those while feeling distinct enough to not tread on their featured status. Keka music features prominent vocals with close-knit harmonies, guitars, drums, keys, all your normal band stuff, if you will, plus a healthy dose of elements of traditional New Caledonian folk music. Traditional New Caledonian music is heavily influenced by the wider music of Melanesia. but has a lot of distinct elements that distinguish it from the music of its island neighbors. Colonial events of the 1930s seem to have expunged a saddening amount of native musical traditions from the record, but several do persist and are alive and in performance practice today, and as such are pretty well documented. The notable elements we decided to incorporate were the pilu, or temperance rhythm, sometimes just called rhythm or kanak rhythm. It's this distinct motor that runs throughout nearly all of the traditional ceremonial dances that remain in practice. You can boil it down to basically a sort of dotted eighth 16th pattern, with strong downbeats emphasized either by accents or just more instruments being brought to bear. Like, this varies a bit depending on where you are in the islands, but that core sound runs through just about every bit of traditional music that has a steady pulse. So here's an example that's particularly emblematic of the trope. It shows up everywhere, and even gets woven into the Keka genre of music I touched on earlier. Sometimes with traditional instruments, sometimes with drum kit and percussion more idiomatic to the reggae influence of the other genres as well. Speaking of traditional instrumentation, let's touch on some of that. Obviously, we have human sounds like foot stomps and claps, but there's a ton of other percussive elements in play. Pounding bamboo is used as a sort of a bass drum kick, while bamboo logs are hollowed out, sometimes made with slots or tongues to give different pitches when struck with stick beaters. And then, as we can see in the picture on the right here, tucked under this gentleman's arm, you see one of the more fascinating hand percussion instruments. The bonchep is absolutely everywhere in New Caledonian music, both in traditional music and modern music. It's sort of a bark beater, if you will. Peeled bark is folded and stuffed with coconut fibers or other plant matter and formed into this sort of triangle shape to be beaten one against the other as a pair. We actually made these into a playable instrument for one of the music sequences in the game. Some larger, more circular types of beaters exist as well, called ebe, which are basically these giant balls of leaves glommed together and bound with, which are usually played by just striking them with your open palm. Think of it as like a beefed up clap. The sonai, on the other hand, are basically a sort of cowbell. Bundles of dried seed pods are tied on dancers' feet and add this characteristic clatter or rattle sound as with every stomp that they make. Again, we made playable instruments of these that Chia can use for some of the musical sequences. And finally, leaves. Yep, you heard right. These little dried fern leaves are so ubiquitous in New Caledonian music that Phil went so far as to bring some back home to France with him after visiting his parents over the holidays, specifically to record them so we could put them in the game. They also 100% break down into just tiny little pieces as you play them, so by the time we got our samples done, they were gone. But I think the results work. I appreciate them having the particle effects of them just disintegrating as you play them. Now, I'm a brass player primarily, so winds come fairly naturally to me, and I wanted to find a way to incorporate some sounds that I could replicate myself. The traditional kanak flute is a transverse flute made of bamboo, with a relatively limited range and a curious mode of playing. It's frequently used almost as more of a rhythmic element than a melodic one. Think of it almost like beatboxing. Now, unlike most of the wood, bamboo, and plant-based instruments, the wessel, which we see here on the right, or whistle, is made of metal and actually began life as a shipboard whistle from European sailing vessels, modified and incorporated into traditional music. You can actually hear the ebe in the background there. Just like the flute, it's used to drive and lend a piercing rhythmic motor to the traditional musical ensemble. While we were able to use some recorded phrases of flute kanaka in the score, I needed something a bit more flexible that still had the same kind of bamboo transverse flute character. And I was fortunate enough to find an instrument that fit the bill perfectly from a small maker when I was in LA for a conference a while back. I used that to voice our villain, Meavora's theme, something mystic, mysterious, and creepy. On the flip side, on a complete whim, I tried an experiment. I took a metal slide whistle I had, I tuned it to the correct bass note of the real whistles, and ran it through some pitch-shifting plugins, and was pleasantly surprised at the results. Works, right? So finally, we get to the vocal element, my favorite. New Caledonia has a rich tradition of song, both homegrown and influenced by the musical traditions imported from Europe by missionaries. There are more than 35 different languages and dialects spoken on the islands, but the two most represented are French and Drehu, and those are what all of our songs' lyrics are written in, thanks to Marilu Lopez Aguilera, our lyricist. Close, largely homophonic harmonies and neat rhythmic text declamation typify a lot of the New Caledonian choral tradition. Along with improvisatory ostinato elements, frequently using the ea pattern of vowels. Along with elements of call and response, little barks and shouts, usually used to cue dancers if used in a pilu setting, and trilling cries to punctuate and add extra interest. So how do we bring all this stuff together? Step 2, the process. So I've touched on a little of this so far, but actually making all this happen on an indie game budget, no less, was a real challenge. Obviously, there was the trick of getting a lot of the unique New Caledonian percussion sounds, and we were fortunate enough to be able to record some of the more idiomatically New Caledonian instruments, leaves, sonai, etc., from proper New Caledonian sources. The ones that Chia needed to be able to play were turned into audio assets and implemented in Fmod by our audio team over at A Shell in the Pit. And because I can't let something that useful go to waste, I also made custom contact instruments out of them as well, which got used throughout the score. Guitars are ubiquitous in Kanaka music, and we knew we wanted to feature guitar prominently, an instrument that, at least at the time I started working on the score, and arguably if you talk to any guitarist, I still do not play. But I was fortunate enough to get to work with some of my friends, Eric Peabody, aka Viking Guitar, and Grant Henry, aka Stemmage, who knocked everything I threw at them out of the park. For everything I didn't record myself, we recorded individual players and built up entire sections out of them. Andrew Steffen over here played our violins and violas. Andrew Stern played cellos. Basses were Travis Kindred. I played all the trumpets and horns. Trombones were Daniel Romberger. Tuba was my good friend Alex Hill. We even got some harmonic in there from Peter Jones. Andrew Steffen even went so far as to use multiple violins and violas to help further mitigate the kind of phasing problems you get when you multi-track yourself and give a realistic variety of timbres within the upper string sections. And finally, the most important part, the vocals, which required, honestly, the most unique approach of all. The process for writing all the songs was similar, but it took a bit of refinement to get it all down. Things start from the script, understanding where the song takes place in the story, what is in response to, what the general feel of the song is supposed to be. From there, I'd have an idea, make a sketch, sometimes something as simple as a voice recording, and I'd send it back to Phil, who would approve it, or come back with notes. Apologies for the aquarium sounds in the background. Lovely, right? Anyway. So if he liked it, Mary Lou would get to work on lyrics, and I'd start adding them in, sending back more examples to Phil, who'd sometimes suggest little tweaks to text setting to make it more correct and naturalistic. Again, remember, I don't speak these languages, and checking and triple checking and quadruple checking with people who do was paramount. From there, we'd create the assets for the singers and the recording studio in New Caledonia and get things packaged up, which it turned out had even more challenges. We realized very quickly that, at least for the choir, there really wasn't much use in preparing scores. They learned everything by rote, which meant creating mock-up stems for every voice part in every cue, in Drehu or French, and singing every part myself, and packaging them all up with lyric sheets and performance instructions that would be translated by Mary Lou for the choristers, director, and recording engineers at the studio in New Caledonia. Basically, starting from here with me, singing all the individual parts, and ending up here with the final recordings. Now, while I wrote a lot of specific parts, 6 or more sometimes in close harmony, etc., one of the things that really brought everything together, and honestly something core to a lot of New Caledonian choral tradition, is improvisation. Whole counter melodies, rhythmic ideas, nonsense syllables, they made them up during the sessions, and we ran with them. Because much like the orchestral recordings, our choir was recorded piecemeal. There were only about 6 singers in total, multi-tracked, usually no more than 2 voices and a stem. I had pretty much total control over the material, which was great for fixing tuning or timing or making blend tweaks in Melodyne. But also, they were able to just send me whatever other cool ideas they happened to come upon during the recording sessions, to be used or not used as the case may be. In fact, there was one cutscene score that provoked enough improvisational ideas that I wound up spinning all those off, or a bunch of them off, into another piece and wrote an entire new cue around them. That's what you're hearing here. It's nice. I just want to live here for a while. I could not use this. So let's take a look at one of these score cues that kind of puts all this stuff together, combining vocals, native instruments, score, or orchestral elements, and really the whole kit and caboodle. So here we have that Pilu rhythm going on. We have some of the percussion elements that we talked about. Some of the shouts, claps in response, some of the improvisational stuff that they came up with during choral sessions. There's your flute beatboxing in the background, the flute kanaka. The kind of vocal trills in response to that as we kind of build back up. More of that cool flute stuff. And now we're into the stuff where we're having choral parts that I've actually written again. And now we bring the orchestra back in. All right, so kind of putting all that stuff together to something that hopefully has the emotional impact while still being true to the music and the culture that we're trying to respect and convey and celebrate. But wait, there's more. It's only 4:20. We got lots of time. Chia's a musical. It's also a rhythm game. 10 interactive musical sequences are spread throughout Chia's story, featuring our voice cast pulling double duty as singers and letting the player perform ukulele and a variety of other native New Caledonian musical instruments alongside in a rhythm game fashion. Songs take place in a variety of story contexts with a rotating cast of characters, instruments, and an increase in difficulty and complexity as the game progresses. But there's one thing that we kept in mind as we designed these. And you can see it here on the tutorial screen for the first music sequence. You can't win or lose at music. Just have fun. That was our mantra for all these systems. And to facilitate that, we decided no fail states. Only note accuracy percentage tallies after each song. You can't lose at music, right? In fact, when you're playing a pitched instrument, we actually lock the default notes to the notes in the scale of the piece. So even if you're completely wrong, it won't sound terrible. More about our actual instrument mechanics shortly. In addition, we have an autoplay system that you can switch on or off at any time, which disables the rhythmic play-along mode and turns it into basically an automatically performed music video. This helped bandage an otherwise unsolvable challenge as well: subtitles. Since every song, in fact, all the dialogue in the game is entirely done in Drehu or French, and a notable amount of our players couldn't be expected to speak either language, having the means for them to turn off the gameplay elements and just free their eyes up to read the subtitles felt a bit more important. I know it's a bit of a hacky solution, but it let us at least have the option of having our cake and eating it too if people couldn't multitask and play and read at the same time. That way we could do that without compromising on the cultural linguistic vision of the game as a whole. Songs begin simple, with the first music sequence, which we looked at earlier, being our introduction to timing and rhythm, with only one button press being required to play. Originally, the next song was designed to introduce and teach the player how to juggle note selection with the left stick and rhythmic timing with the face buttons. Chia alternates between sonai and wanjeps, selecting the instrument by pushing the stick up for wanjep or down for sonai, and pressing any of the face buttons to play. Unfortunately, for my idealized tutorial goals, the sequence ended up falling so soon after the first sequence in the average play experience that it felt too much too fast. Literally a month or so before launch, we decided to move it to a flashback sequence later in the game. It was the correct choice. It was the right flow choice for the game, and it all adapted just fine, moving directly from leaves to ukulele in the third sequence. Now, apologies for my ADHD. This feels like the right time to do a little walkthrough of how the ukulele in the game is designed and functions, so we can then talk about how it functions differently in the song sequences and how those were crafted afterwards. At any given moment, after a certain point in the story, Chia can unsling her ukulele from her backpack and play it. Very, very early on, Phil knew he wanted to give players a musical tool to interact with the environment, and the ukulele was the natural choice. Melodically capable, popular across Polynesia, Oceania, and small enough for a kid to carry with her, it was the ideal choice. The pitch wheel for note selection was the first thing to go in. You use the left stick to select a note, and then the two face buttons play either the low or high octave. After that, we had to figure out how to fit, well, just every other thing you could do with a ukulele onto a standard controller. Piece of cake, right? So, the system is a bit complex, but at the end of the day, it works like this. Note selection is handled with the left stick. Default C to C, a C major scale, which works super well for ukulele music. Face buttons control single note low octave, single note high octave, chord strum down and up. When designing the chord system, we stuck with simple triads, omitting extended chords like 7s, 9s, 11s, etc., because at the very least, having only a triad would never present a clash, and people could always add notes to imply extended harmonies if they wanted to, with single plucks if they needed to. Chords are, by default, diatonic to the key in question, so C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. And then, of course, the octave. And now this is where it gets fun. For each chord we strum, we can shift the chord quality on a spectrum with the bumpers, either left, making it for smaller intervals, if you will, or right, making those intervals larger. So using C major and pushing the left bumper gives us C minor. Conversely, using the right bumper takes us to wider C augmented. This applies all the way up the scale, or down, the way this chart shows it. C can be minor, major, augmented. D can be diminished, minor, major. E can be diminished, minor, or major. F can be minor, major, or augmented. G can be minor, major, or augmented. A can be diminished, minor, or major. And B can be only diminished or minor, which I admit was a little bit of a hard sell to not have a third option, but sticking with the correct music theory kind of convinced them. Yes, now that we've all covered Music Theory 101, let's move on here. Now I can hear you saying that's not every possible chord or even every possible note, which is where I say I know because we've still got triggers. So, the triggers on our ukulele control two things, or one of two things. If pressed after a note has been played, they let you pitch bend up or down by a half step, kind of like a whammy bar sort of thing. It's cool. You can even do some vibrato with them if you're clever. If you press them before a note has been played, though, the entire circle shifts up or down a half step. Now, between that and exploiting the magic of enharmonics, we've got every possible triad that we could want, all functioning and playable on a standard controller layout. And that's our ukulele. Thank you. I think I must have been on like 4 different calls with Phil for an extended period of time, which is like why you have that, he drew that incredibly sweaty picture of himself there in the corner. Like, as I'm like describing how the music theory needs to be to make, we got to cover everything. He's like, what about this? I'm like, don't worry, it'll work. It was great. Anyway, that gives us a fully functional instrument. You can play any melody, any chords with a solid amount of variation, tons of round robin recordings across the entire range of the instrument. Also, it was super lovely, as we kind of hoped secretly, to see so many weird covers like pop up of people playing popular songs and like The Last of Us and all kinds of other weird stuff. It was great. Anyhow, back to songs, and thank you for putting up with my ADHD digression, which is really like an entire chapter in a book. Anyhow, for the actual musical sequences, we had to tweak the freeform music system of the ukulele somewhat. For starters, we would gear shift the note wheel into the key required, with the note options becoming diatonic to the key in the piece. In this example, we are in D major. So if the player misses notes, even if they miss notes, they'll still be playing in D major. And it can't sound that bad, because remember, you can't win or lose in music, just have fun. So once we'd spell out the notes and chords in the key, I'd prepare the MIDI files for Benjamin DePorkery, the programmer who helmed the rhythm game system. I'd start with writing the ukulele part on just one MIDI track, or as just one MIDI track, then copy-paste it into all 4, adapt it, breaking phrases up across 4 different MIDI tracks, one for each of the possible articulations. Low octave pluck, high octave pluck, chord strum down, and chord strum up. One note for each note in the game's rhythm sequence. Those files, combined with a chart showing BPM, the BPM for every song is fixed, by the way. Any kind of rubato or rallentando stuff is entirely fake. Like, there is a locked BPM, we slow down and we speed back up, and it's fine. No one knows. It's good. We can technically have those tempo changes, but I kept them to a minimum, and they really only happened at the end of pieces. I'd have to, like, SMTPE lock everything, and it was a fun time. Anyway, so tempo, BPM, meter, pertinent count-off information about syncing, all the note and chord key signature info, and all the pertinent notes on each music sequence went in a document and got sent over, and then we were good. Now, the cool thing about our system is that by breaking up all the articulations into separate MIDI stems, the actual rhythm gameplay becomes just all about using the stick to select the right note at the right time and pressing any face button, with it auto-selecting chords strummed up or down or individual notes across both octaves without the player having to really do anything. All they got to do is choose the right note, press the right button. Remember, also, we got some bonus stuff out of this. That autoplay system I described, so we wouldn't have to necessarily play and just enjoy the music video. Yeah, when it takes over, it just automatically triggers the MIDI data for those tracks in real time. So the hand positions, oh, by the way, all the ukulele hand positions are correct and accurate. So they all match what you'd have for real ukulele chords, etc. And so like music notes, all that stuff, you just get it for free now. It's super cool. So switching it on and off can happen in real time, and she continues to play the correct notes, and they all animate correctly because it's tied in systemically. Now, there's a lot more material to cover about how Chia's open world was broken up into musical zones for each biome, tons of interactive activities, or even take a deep dive into the Fmod-powered interactive music systems that make our open world and stealth combat encounters feel vibrant. Or I could spend another 20 minutes of talking about how we designed the Mwalkin voices for these strange wooden creatures with a combination of blown bottle sounds, percussion instruments, and weird wood noises. But time is a little bit short, although actually I think I've been sweating and going fast up here that we have more time than I thought. So I want to end our talk on one of the music sequences. This was originally written in the manner of one of the French folk songs, but Louise here has spent some time translating it for Chia. And as such, when we hear it in this reprise in Drehu, I incorporated more of the native New Caledonian rhythmic elements. Let's listen. Coming into the background during this section. Thank you very, very much. That was Ella Vidin singing there. She played Louise, and just a wonderful, adorable voice. When I got the first recordings back for that, that just made my day. All of the voice cast was tremendous, and all the choir members were wonderful. And it was great to kind of get to feature them in so many ways. But yeah, that's basically it. It was an absolute joy to get to work on something as special as Chia, and collaborating with so many fantastically talented folks from all over the globe to make this happen was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and one I would not give up for the world. And now I think we have time for some questions, if we want to hit them. I'm going to cheat, because I've been standing this whole time. I'm going to sit over here. But if we have questions, we could line up here by the mic and hit me with them, okay? Unless I've answered everything preemptively.
Really wonderful talk, just wanted to say. My question, well, slight preface. I'm currently working on a game that has elements that tie to a particular country, and unfortunately, I kind of got more of this information late into development. But the work that you've done and having the amount of time that you were given at the start of the project, is that something that you often get? Like, do you normally try and, like, how common is it for you to get, you know, half a year to do this amount of preparation before diving into a project like this?
That is, I mean, it can be rare. Like, this is, a lot of the indie game projects I've worked on have had an extremely long, development time, and I've been brought in very early. So I first heard about this game, I think, in 2017, and I think I wrote the main theme for it in 2017, but, like, getting all of the timbral elements in play, getting everything else. The melody was there, but dialing in what made it correct and proper for New Caledonia was a process. It took a lot of research, et cetera. As far as time, like, usually you don't have that kind of time, I would imagine, but ideally you know what it is going in, you know? Like I said, when I got asked to do it, I really straight up asked, like, is you sure you want me to do it? Like, maybe we can, like, maybe there's someone better for this. And barring that, it was the choice of either I need to put in the work to make this happen and find the people to collaborate with to bring this to life properly, or I would feel real bad about, like, I don't know, like, faking it, whitewashing it, what have you. So whatever you can do to try to make and find that time to do the research on it, you know, find people to collaborate with is a good, I don't want to say shortcut, because there's no shortcuts in this, but it's a good way to, like, have the authenticity, to have someone to work with who does know about that. You know, that would be my advice in that sort of situation.
Okay, appreciate it, thank you.
Cool, no problem. Yes, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was incredible, and your music's so beautiful.
Thank you so much.
So I'm curious, the instruments that you hadn't written for before, that were new to you, did you have access to those instruments? Did you get to play them and get familiar?
The percussion instruments and the other things, or so I didn't actually. Like those we were able to record in New Caledonia, and, like, I sampled and broke out, like, some things like the leaves, literally, like, they were brought home in a cardboard box so that we could record them, and brought home by Phil. So they went to France, not to America. And I'm like, okay, can we get, like, up and down strokes this many times, and then, like, do some rhythmic stuff, and maybe we can use that. And, like, trying to emulate the sorts of things that they use that stuff for to get the right sound. Like the other instruments, like, okay, this is a very simple bamboo flute. I literally, like, some of the during the process, I was, like, watching documentary footage in French of a guy, like, building one of these flutes. Like, going out, literally, like, find a piece of bamboo that works properly and build it. Like, okay, I see how you make this. And there's a ton of variety. So much. That's one of the things that really was remarkable. Is so much of the native instruments are literally just, like, I don't want to call them, like, found instruments, but it's like we harvest the plant that makes the right shape, and then we modify it and, like, craft it into something, and now you have a flute or a drum or whatever else. And so it was like, okay, I can see how these are made. How can I emulate that here with the things that I have, or can I acquire things that will do that, or can we sample the real thing and then turn it into a virtual instrument? Because, you know, during the process of this game, like, there's 5.5 hours of music in this game. And it took and a lot of that, like, spun up as we went along. We didn't know when we were starting out how big it was going to be. And it got way bigger as we went. So having virtual instruments, or instruments that I had access to just kind of sit down and go, I need to expand this. What do I have that I can use that will still have that authentic flavor and the right sound? Like, that was the stuff I went to and picked up every time.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks so much.
You're most welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk, John. That was great. I kind of wanted to piggyback off of the first question. If you had to pick 2 or 3 techniques when it comes to composing music that are most valuable when it comes to making a soundtrack feel, let's say, authentic or from a period, right? Could be any sort of composition technique, anything, songwriting, whatever, music choice. What would those top 2 or 3 be for you?
So what would be the top 2 or 3 techniques that I would use to add authenticity to something?
Yeah, techniques, whether that's in songwriting or choice of instruments or anything really.
Gotcha. Boy, that's a really complicated question. I mean, the first thing for me is to understand the kind of breadth of the cultural the music in question. One of the things I mentioned, it's surprising when you look at a lot of the folk music of New Caledonia, because there is some stuff that happens in the early part of the 20th century where they lose a lot of their, it seems like, looking at the records, they lose a lot of their cultural musical heritage, and only some sorts of things get preserved and continued. So it almost is like a necking down of a more broad background. So understanding okay, what do we have that we can definitely use that will connect authentically with this, and finding an element. In this case, it was the pilu rhythm, which is just everywhere, dot, 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 dot. And literally every example I can find, it's almost within 10 BPM of that tempo. And so I'm okay, that has to run through this the lifeblood of this score, because that is a thing that gets used in the traditional music. That is a thing that gets used in Keka music. It's you're listening to something that sounds almost reggae, but there is that pulse throughout it, because that is the thing that they use. So you find the thing that is, if you could boil it down to one thing, what's it gonna be? And then on top of that, I would say look for instrumentation that can tie you to that place as well. So one thing, and ideally you want more than one thing here, but those are the first things I would look for. Okay, that's a hard question to do, but hopefully that answers some of it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks.
No problem. Yes, sir.
I just had a question regarding when you were writing the music for the choir. How was it? Was it kind of difficult to help them vocalize what you wanted, or did you have help along with, your assistant when it came to recording with them? Because you mentioned about them doing their vowels really easily with that, and they sounded really good too as well. So
thank you. I basically the first thing I did was I wrote. I basically for some of the songs for the main cast where they're singing solos, I gave them sheet music and I gave them mock-ups of me singing it, and that worked pretty well. For the choir though, we very quickly realized they don't read sheet music, and they basically learned everything by rote. So I basically did my best to sing in Drehu, to sing this stuff correctly. And I know I didn't do it right sometimes, because I would get back them singing it correctly, I botched that consonant completely. Yeah. It is a fascinating language, and the way that has been, as they've converted, this to Latin characters, to write it out. I assume this is something that comes from, this is the French figuring out, we're going to figure out how to write this using our characters. Suddenly it's okay, I don't know why they chose some of the characters they chose. As someone who can sing in French, it still doesn't make a connection. So I would have to go back and double check to see I was pronouncing it as close as I could to correct, and then make these mock-ups so that they could sing with that, and individually stemming out every bit. And they would, in the sessions, they would just listen to it, and then sing. And I would put all the expression that I wanted things to be into my performance. And it was basically just, I'm going to model this, and then they're going to embellish on what I've done. And the nice thing about having everything broken up into one person at a time recording, or 2 people in a section, meant that if there was something that wasn't quite right, or a note that wasn't perfect, I could change it, and it was one tiny bit. And Melodyne is really good for making that kind of granular alteration, if you have the small pieces, no one can really tell. And so you can tweak stuff. If they sang a minor third instead of a major third, nudge, and you're fine, you know? So, but yeah, it was an interesting process. And I wish, like, there were things I wish I could have done differently or done better, you know, because there was no high-speed internet to, like, dial in and watch while they were in the studio. So it was very much like I wrote out as many instructions and notes as I could and sent them over there, you know, and they were translated and handed off. And then I get back stuff that was pretty darn close to what I asked for, but it was like, here you go. Here's some video of the session too, just for fun, and here's a Dropbox with all this stuff. And so I'd like be in communication with them, but it was never in real time. It was always this, like, you're sending something to the other side of the world and they aren't even awake, and then you're getting stuff. You know, I was sending stuff to France when they were awake barely, and then they would go all the way to New Caledonia, and then it would come back to me, and it was this whole long process. It was very, I'm not going to say it was like smooth, but it was one of these things where at the end of the day, you put in the hours required to do it to make it good, you know, because it matters at the end of the day. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers perfect.
Cool. Yes, hello.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the ukulele system design.
Sure.
And if, like looking back at it, if there's anything that you would change, or just like overall.
I would, man, sorry, the desire to like comment on the fact that, like, we did the system, and then The Last of Us 2 came out.
I was going to start there. I was going to say it's so similar in terms of the design, which is why I'm wondering.
Oh, it's so funny because so a bunch of the team actually worked on a game called Wandersong before that. I'm the voice of the bard in Wandersong, so they made my voice into a virtual instrument. But the way you do note selection in that, you know, which I guess if you go back, like, might be like there are some other games that have done a note selection with a stick, you know, is kind of similar. And so that's where we started from with our design, was this circular thing, and then you're playing with the face buttons. Now, if I had to do it all over again and we had infinite budget and time, boy, it would be cool to, like, have, like, PlayStation Touch interface stuff to, like, strum properly up, down, and tap to play single things. But I also feel like that might be very awkward to hold. I don't know. I have not played around with that very much. It would be cool to have an even more granular thing. But if you did that, I feel like you also wouldn't get the half step and chord shift, you know, with the bumpers. So the answer is, I hope I never have to do it again. But I'm really happy with how it worked.
Thank you.
It'll be great. Thank you so much. Yes, hello.
Hi, yeah, thank you. This was a great talk. This, like, kind of tickled both the ethnomusicology background side and then the music theory side of my brain, which was really awesome.
I love, like,
So.
musicology is one of my favorite things, and like ethnomusicology is super fascinating. You know,
Yeah.
Learning about the music of other cultures and then trying to, you know, take that and learn from it, and also, like, you know, incorporate it is super neat. And so this was a fun project because of that.
Totally. So my question was kind of along those lines. I have a background in ethnomusicology, and there's a lot of, you know, discourse in that field about representation and who we're kind of centering and how we're engaging with research and researchers and the folks that we're you know, trying to represent. Like, you know, as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm wondering if you encounter, you know, all of that takes so much time, right? I'm wondering if you encountered any issues with timelines pushing back against the need for quality research, and kind of how, if you did, how you navigated that and advocated for.
The answer is not really, like, because I got into it so early and the game was so early that I had a test piece, and that I had this image in my mind of, like, this is the melody of this main theme. And then, like, my go-to when I start a new project is I usually try to figure out what the palette is that I'm working with. And the way I do that is I usually have a main theme idea that is, you know, like, or the main character has a theme, and that's the idea that I go with. And I try to build the palette around that. And then I will show that to the director, the developer, the writer, whoever is in charge of that sort of thing, you know, or the whole team if it's a very, like, you know, everybody has a say kind of project, which is always a bit of an exciting thing. But anyway, and hopefully they like it. And if they don't, I try to refine it. And usually I only do a little bit of it at a time to try to I abhor wasting time, so I want to do it right the first time, or do a little bit of it, find out it's not right, and then redirect. And in this case, I was in so early that I was able to spend that time finding the correct thing and doing all the research that was required. The only thing I was pushing up against or pushing back against was just my own time for like, because as a freelance composer, you're rarely working on one project. I think I had like 3 going at the same time, and so it was like, another failure. I have to try again. I have to look at all this other stuff. I'm being told, oh, it's too bombastic. It's like, okay, we're gonna get rid of the timpani. We're gonna try to like find some appropriate percussion that is from another. Like we got good sample libraries of like these Polynesian drums, which is really close. In timbres, we can use that instead. We will use these other instruments. And like tuning in like what works. The whole, incorporating the Pilu rhythm was the big thing that like really made it stick. Like, yes, this is the glue, this is the sauce that brings it all together. And like, so really the only thing I was pushing up against was my own like feeling of like revving my engine while the parking brake is on and not going anywhere. I'm like, surely, eventually I'll get it, and then finally getting it. So, yeah, it's tricky, but also I wouldn't want to try to do something like this in a rushed state, So, but obviously you don't always have that choice. So, yeah, I don't want to be like crunch until you get it right, but no, there you go. Anyway, please don't take that out of context, GDC. Thank you. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes, hello.
Hey.
Again.
No. Hearing your talk, it sounded like you and possibly the lead developer, I'm not exactly sure what their role was, worked very closely in tandem to get this going. I guess as someone who normally works with session musicians and hires, folks, diving into a realm where it's a country where, where you're dealing with a language that you don't speak, how could this have been as successful without the aid of your developer in this? Like, do you feel like you could have done, I guess I think of most composers not really needing the director's aid to get this done. It's kind of like, what you need me to do, okay, I can do all of it. But it sounds like a lot of this was like a partnership in terms of help and aid from the...
It really was. It was like passing a gate check. It was like, you gotta like, like if you've ever, like, I'm thinking about I'm thinking in video game terms of like, have you built your character correctly? If you built your character correctly in this RPG, this boss, you can handle this boss. And the boss was my boss. So if I built the music correctly and it passes his estimation, we've done it right, good. But that's maybe not the right, like I get some feedback from him about things that weren't quite there, but it was like trying to like find and dial in what was correct and what we needed to have for the sound that he wasn't really sure what it needed to be, but he knew what it was not. And he had some references, and he had like choral references from like the choirs, the Melanesian choirs, and like the Thin Red Line soundtrack, for example, and things like that. Like that is stuff that you get over there. These church choir traditions from that come out of like Catholic Church missionaries heading over and teaching people how to sing and that kind of stuff. So we knew we wanted some of that stuff in there. We knew, we had these other influences that we wanted to have in the score, but it really was a matter of like, working with Phil, or really checking with Phil to see if I had gotten it to where it needed to be, as someone who's from there and knows the kind of stuff, to see if I was replicating it correctly. I think like one of the final tricks, and this sounds real weird and wild, was instead of using any, like for our mock-ups, instead of using any choir sample libraries, was singing all the parts myself in the kind of vocal timbre, straight tone, kind of very bright forward sound that you hear in a lot of that music. And that was it. That was the final thing. It was like, that's the choir sound that I want. Where, it was like crossing that little Rubicon where you're like, we've got this. And then when we actually had the real people come in and sing it, it was a billion times better, obviously. But yeah, it was very much a collaborative process. But I try to collaborate pretty closely with, all the directors that I've worked with, especially when it is something that is so specifically grounded in a place and grounded in a culture, it just seems that, especially like you said, that I'm not from, that I don't speak the language and everything else, it becomes all the more important to do so.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Any other questions? We actually have like 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
It's not so much a question, just an observation that of something you said, that particular rhythm takes place within about 10 beats per minute every time it shows up. This is something, this happens in Balinese gamelan music, where there's specific rhythms that only appear at certain tempos. And it's really interesting because it really builds that identity of the music, is knowing that happens. It's like everybody knows that. When it shifts gears, it's like, oh, when it goes here and comes up here, it's this rhythm at this tempo for this amount of time. And that there's a recognizable, and we don't get this so much in Western music, of that rhythmic identity that you hear in other things. So just wanted to pull that out a little bit if you want to talk about that some more.
No, absolutely. No, that is like very much like we get that. And there's actually like a lot of examples of music where like if you take the rhythm and you were to like notate it in MIDI and have it being played back on MIDI instruments and you slow it down, it loses all of the energy and the identity of it. So if you're going like, what is that? It's like some real draggy swing now, and nobody likes that. But if you speed up, now it's a car engine that's misfiring. But in this pocket, it sounds right, and it is a thing, and it is an identity of its own. And you get that in, like Latin jazz, like if you have like that clave, the clave part, if you slow it way down, it's super strange. It doesn't feel right. Like there's a lot of stuff where there is a pocket that this rhythm, that this identity exists in, and outside that pocket, it doesn't have the character that you want it to have. And so like that was the thing, like realizing that like the Pilu rhythm was the thing that really persisted and is in everything. And a lot of the dance stuff is built with that pulse, but then everything else happens around it. Like one of the challenges that actually you're making me. Do you mind if I spin a random side digression here from this? One of the fun bits in the game is one of the music sequences is a Pilu ceremony, is a dance, and it's incredibly beautifully choreographed thing. And having watched just dozens and dozens of examples of this stuff by this point, it was like, I need to replicate all of the elements that are in play here for like 2.5 minutes of this before we transition to like orchestral stuff. And I get to take away things from this diegetic music effectively and go into score. And trying to do that properly and get all of the different instruments, and then like having the animator, like writing this thing first, and then having the animators go back. I say animators, I think really it was like one person doing all that because we were a team of 12 people, going back and like building the people playing drum, like the log drum on a rack, pounding the bamboo on the ground, playing wanjeps and doing, sonai stomps and stuff like that in time with the music that I wrote to match what was happening in the score, in the diegetic score after the fact, was a wild and cool thing to see. But it was also like, this is the final test. Can I make effectively something that is mostly improvised around a form that everybody knows who does this stuff? Can I do that authentically? And then weave that into score as the scene goes along was a super difficult challenge to make happen. And I'm really proud of how it came out. And like having talked to and heard like on Twitter, like people from New Caledonia talking about like how this sequence like brought them like, to an emotional state that was like really like seeing this stuff, seeing their culture, and this ceremony like brought into video games, into front and center, was like a really moving thing. Was like incredibly touching, and knowing that like I guess I'd done it right. Like that's like the confirmation, I guess. Like and it felt really cool to see that sort of thing. So anyway, that's my weird digression. I didn't have anywhere to put that in the talk, and it felt weird to just staple it in. But thanks. Anyhow, any other questions? Cool. We are with 32 seconds to go. We are done. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Check out the game if you like. We just literally, during the last period, we just launched on Steam, and we announced we're coming to Switch soon too. So we're out on soon, like just about everything. That'll be cool. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Please feel free to fill out your evaluation forms. I think they asked me to say if you thought it was okay, maybe say it was okay. I don't know. But otherwise, tell your friends. Thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful GDC, everyone.